Thank you so much for joining us today. As you get settled in, welcome. I'm Jo Taranto, and I'm coming to you from Parramatta today on Darug country. I'm the founder of Good for the Hood, and it's my absolute pleasure to bring you this webinar today in partnership with Sydney Water. Good for the Hood, if you don't know, is a social enterprise. We work with communities around Australia, communicating those tricky environmental and sustainability topics that are so critical to the quality of life that we expect in Australia. We're really passionate about sharing solutions, and that's why we're part of today's webinar, because we believe that what we're talking about today is very important for not only my community, but all of your communities across Greater Sydney, to not only mitigate and adapt to climate change, but to build things like social cohesion and resilience, and to be really the best city in the world, in my opinion. So thank you for being part of it. We have people coming to us from all over Greater Sydney, from Hawkesbury in the north down to the Illawarra. Today, we are going to learn a bit more about our water systems across Sydney, where our water comes from, where it goes once we've used it, and why it's so important to understand our water system and possibly to think differently about how we manage water in Sydney. We're going to learn about water supply options. We're going to learn about how we can make sure we don't run out of water in Sydney, which, as we can imagine, would be a disaster for anyone. I'm going to chat to our wonderful guests today for about 40 minutes, but there is absolutely an opportunity for you to ask questions. We have a Q&A function today. If you haven't used it, it's very simple, but please, as we go along, don't wait till the end. You feel free to put questions in throughout the session as we go, and we will try and answer as many as possible. Even if we answer it halfway through the session, all the better. But please make sure that if you've got a question, you get it in the chat today. I'll get Anna to share our slide, but it is really important that we acknowledge the traditional custodians, and Sydney Water and Good for the Hood acknowledge the ancestors of the lands and waters where we work, live and learn. The Dharawal, the Gundungurra, the Darkinjung and the Darug nations, of which the Greater Sydney Basin covers. We acknowledge their law and traditions and customs, and that they were nurtured and continued to nurture the waters, the salt water and the sweet water of Sydney Water's operating area, creating well-being for all. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. All right. Well, with me today is Kate Miles, and Kate is Sydney Water's Head of System Planning and Land Acquisitions. Kate's got 20 years experience. She's very well placed through her work in public and private sectors to talk about integrated water cycle management. Kate's been involved in all facets of water infrastructure as far as I can tell, and I couldn't think of a better person to be able to share her passion for the work that she does with Sydney Water. I know that, Kate, you've been involved with a bit of a mouthful, but Sydney Water's first long-term capital and operational plan, which has, as all things, an acronym, LETCOP, and it's an adaptive plan that talks about Sydney Water's key infrastructure and investment and operations decisions all the way through to 2050, that critical year when we start talking about climate change as well. So please welcome Kate, and thank you for being with me today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Kate, can you tell us a little bit about Sydney Water and the work that you do to deliver water to all these households across the basin?
Yeah, I'm gonna use some big numbers here. So, Greater Sydney is a large area, obviously, and you can see it there on your screen. That's our area of operations. So we service 5.3 million customers every day across that Greater Sydney region. So that means that we provide about 1.5 billion litres of safe drinking water every day to homes, and that we also then treat that wastewater from homes, businesses and industries as well. So we've actually been running as a business for about 135 years. We also do have some assets in the ground still that are still providing a great service that are about 135 years old too. Obviously it's quite a large area. We go from Palm Beach in the north, Blue Mountains in the west, and then down to the Illawarra in the south. And if you were to lay all of our pipes end to end, they would go around the world 1.25 times, which is a recent statistic that I learned and something that blew me away.
That's amazing. Wow, that's a lot of things to maintain, my goodness.
Yeah, sure is.
You've been interested in water for a long time. You grew up on a farm like me. So has it always been something that you've been aware of?
Yeah, I think, like, I honestly think that that childhood that I had led to a large extent to where I am today. So, like, even as a kid, growing up on a farm, we had rainwater tanks, and that was where our water supply came from. Um, I think I've got a hard stomach because of all the frogs that lived inside those rainwater tanks. We didn't really know much about cleaning rainwater tanks back then. But my sister and I would play in the creek out the front of the house when it was flowing, and build little dams and knock them over and see what would happen. When there was too much rain, there were like 7 causeways between our place and town, and so we'd be cut off from town. But then also during times of drought, like, that was really, really difficult for us. The whole our whole livelihood, our whole water supply was reliant on rainfall. So I do think that a lot of that is what resulted in me ending up becoming a water engineer. But of course, in Greater Sydney, our drinking water is of really high quality and it's really reliable. And so often we don't really have to think about it. And it's sort of until sometimes we travel overseas, or to smaller towns where the tap water maybe isn't safe to drink, or is very scarce, that we really think about where our water comes from.
So what do most people tell you when they talk about drinking water, Kate? Do they think that it comes from any of those in particular?
Yeah, I think most people in Sydney are fairly well aware of the fact that we have dams that supply the city. I think folks are usually aware that we do have a desalination plant, but probably aren't quite so aware as to how much we've actually been using that desalination plant. I think there's a bit of a misconception that it doesn't get used and that it hasn't been used, but we've in fact, we have been quite reliant on it in recent years in particular. Yeah. I think most people know of Warragamba, but it's actually one of 11 dams that we have that supplies the city. It is the biggest, which is probably why people know it. But yeah, we have several other dams that provide services to different parts of the city, and that we can move water around between as well.
Yeah, right. And that means we're pretty reliant on dams, and that means rainfall, I'm assuming, to catch that water. Is there a misconception about desalination though? Can you tell us a bit more about how that works for Sydney, Kate?
Yeah, so for those that don't really know much about desalination, so it is a process where we take seawater and remove the salts and the other impurities that exist within the ocean, to treat it to a standard that it can be put straight back into the drinking water supply. So we have one desalination plant in Sydney at Canal, and that provides up to 15% of Greater Sydney's entire drinking water supply. So originally when it was built as a drought mitigation measure, so built to operate only during drought. But it's actually remained in operation since the last drought due to poor raw water quality in our dams that we've experienced since the drought broke. So as you'd imagine, when it rains a lot, lots of sediments flow into the dams, and then they also continue to be disturbed every time we get large rainfall events. And so that makes the water really dirty. So it just stirs everything up inside. I think we've got some good social media posts that show you what the water can look like when we get that kind of rainfall. And so when the water in the dams gets dirty, it actually takes longer to filter. And so we use the desalination plant to make sure that we can still get customers safe and reliable water when the dam water is of poorer quality. So we supplement the volume using the desalination plant, and the desalination plant now does operate on a flexible, continuous full-time basis as needed. So we can ramp it up and ramp it down depending on how much water we need.
Right. So this might seem like a ridiculous question from someone who doesn't work in the space, Kate, but what happens to water after we've used it? So the water in my home after I've washed the dishes or flushed the toilet or had a shower, where does it go and what happens to it?
Been talking to my 6-year-old son a lot about this recently and trying to educate him on this. And I think it's probably something that in the past we didn't talk a lot about. We didn't really want people to think about where their water went, but I think it is actually really important for people to understand that whole water cycle, which is why I'm here today. But so all the water that we use from our taps, toilets, showers, laundry, kitchen, etc., goes to Sydney Water's water resource recovery facilities. You might also know them as a wastewater treatment plant or a sewage treatment plant. We try to recover resources rather than just dispose of them, hence the name. But that's where we treat the wastewater to make it safe for subsequent, environmental discharge or use.
And does that mean you have to take a lot of stuff out of it? I just know some of the things that get, down the drain in the sink alone, let alone, the toilet and other things. There must be a lot of things that have to be taken out of the water.
Yeah, we find a surprising number of unusual things in the wastewater. I think there was a kayak found recently in one of our large wastewater pipelines. I don't know how that got there. But yeah, so we use advanced technology to remove things that have been added to the water. So the level of treatment that we use at each of the plants depends on where that treated water is going after we treat it. So, and that could be back into like rivers or lakes, or it could be back into the ocean, or it could be recycled for subsequent use, to flush toilets, to use in people's gardens, or to be used by industry. So those are the kinds of, different levels of treatment we would provide depending on where we're putting the water.
And so you mentioned a bit of recycled water there. Is there other things that you can reuse? Like does the waste get reused as well?
Yeah, so Sydney Water collects all of our what we call like their organic solids that come out of the wastewater treatment process. So we collect them, we process them and turn them into a safe, stable, nutrient-rich product that's used as fertilizer. So we call it biosolids. Those biosolids are used often then in agriculture to grow crops. We've also done things like we've partnered recently with Gemina to produce a renewable natural gas from the biogas that comes out of our wastewater treatment plant at Malabar. So it's a green gas, and that gas is actually now being used to, cook dinners and heat homes in parts of Sydney. And they're just a couple of examples. We're always looking for ways in which we can, reuse the products as opposed to just disposing of them.
Makes sense. It would make my my parents very happy to know that reuse continues in all aspects of our life. What about saving water? I know that during times of water restrictions, it's pretty important to conserve water. How does Sydney Siders rate when it comes to saving water?
So Sydney Siders have done a fantastic job. So since the year 2000, we have set, so that was the millennium drought. We've seen a huge reduction in the amount of water that people use across the region. So on average, every person uses about a third less water than what they were using back in 2020 prior to that big millennium drought. So we've got water conservation programs and campaigns that we have to help to reduce the water usage in homes and businesses. But there's also been things like new building regulations with basics, but also water efficiency labelling schemes, so the WELS scheme, which has really helped to shift how the market has positioned itself. So we've seen a lot more efficient appliances. I'm sure everyone, when you go out to buy a washing machine or a dishwasher, you'll look at that water rating and the electricity rating before you make a choice. So those kinds of products have really helped to shift behaviours. But so water conservation has saved our customers, so all of you on the line who live in the Greater Sydney area, an enormous amount of money on their bills as well. So it's meant that we've been able to defer the need to build bigger pipes, water and wastewater pipes. And that's just because everybody's been using less. And so those initiatives are all really important and they're all ongoing. And we all need to play that role in conserving water, but water conservation isn't the only thing that we need to solve the problem.
We're here basically today to talk about the future, which is the work that you've been focusing on at Sydney Water. Why is it an important time to think about water futures and securing that for Greater Sydney?
Yeah, so I mean, we've obviously had a long history in providing water and wastewater services to Greater Sydney, and lots of new facilities have been built over the years, but it's been a while since we've needed to build a new water supply. So the desalination plant was the last one. But with a changing climate and the city that continues to grow, we've really reached a tipping point when it comes to planning for Greater Sydney's future. We've managed quite well with our large number of dams and with that desalination plant, and obviously with the water conservation we just spoke about. But we're now at that point where the demand for the city actually exceeds the average supply that's available. And so, yeah, so we need to build something new. But I do wonder if people really understand how much of our water supply relies on rainfall, especially in a country that's known for its droughts.
And so what you're saying is there's, our catchment and the water that's coming through our taps, a percentage of it is coming through just from rainfall. So I didn't know this before, but I would have said that, that maybe half our water came from rainfall and that half came from other places. What is the figure, Kate, that we Sydney siders rely on in terms of rainfall?
Yeah, so up to 15% of our supply can be provided through the desalination plants. That means that at least 85% of Greater Sydney's drinking water comes from dams, and so hence is reliant on rainfall. And the drought a few years ago, it doesn't feel like very long ago, but a few years ago really highlighted how much we depend on those dams for water.
Wow. And so obviously if drought does come and we have longer and worsening droughts, that can put us in a bit of a tricky position. We hear a lot about climate change and the impact that it will have on particularly on water supplies. And I think that the way I've been explaining it to people is that, carbon's one type of currency we talk about when it comes to climate change. But for me, water's like the dividend that happens depending on how well we manage our carbon. What impact will climate change have on our water supply in Sydney?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people here will remember the drought between 2018 and 2020. But what people probably don't realise was that it was actually the most severe drought in Sydney's history, so on record. And what I mean by that is that the dams dropped faster than they have ever before. There was just much, much, much less inflow into the dams than what we would see during a typical drought. So we actually lost 50% of the dam water in 2.5 years. And we were very lucky that drought ended up being a much shorter drought than is typical. But then that drought ended with the most incredible deluge of rain. I think the people who can remember the drought will remember the flooding that occurred immediately to then break that drought. So our dams filled within about 24 hours. And left large parts of Sydney flooded. So, and then you might think that, okay, so we've had the drought and then we've had flooding, they're both obviously climate change impacts. But what you might not realise is that those heavy downpours then brought all the sediment into the catchment, including ash from the bushfires, because during that drought period, we also had intense bushfires, including within the Warragamba Dam catchment in particular. And so all those sediments washed into the dam, which then led to the worst water quality that we had in a dam in the history of the records that we've got as well. And so that meant that our drinking water was harder to clean. And, you know, and that drinking water quality in the dams has continued to be impacted by rainfall events since then. We're obviously still providing clean, safe drinking water, and the desal plant has assisted with that. But so we really need to diversify our water supply sources for more, like drought is obviously a critical reason, but there's other climatic events that also, I guess, provide a driver to making sure that we diversify.
It's kind of the trifecta of problems, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It sounds tough. So, I mean, it must be a real, you know, the nervousness around that. What does it look like to diversify the water supply then?
Yeah, so the Sydney desalination plant, or the desal plant, as I might refer to it, there's only one in Sydney at the moment. So, but it was designed so that we could double its capacity, you know, in a relatively shorter period of time than it would take to build a new desalination plant. And so investigations for the expansion of that desal plant have begun. And you know, many people would often suggest that we provide more recycled water for non-drinking purposes as well, so for gardens and toilets and the likes. And this is a great option, and we do continue to look at further what we call purple pipe recycled water for those kinds of purposes, but it does also have its constraints, and the main one really is that you need a whole separate purple pipe system to convey that water. And so it does get quite costly to build those schemes and then also maintain them, because you've effectively got a drinking water network, a wastewater network, and then you've also got a recycled water network. So a third set of pipes.
So can you tell us about purified recycled water then? It's different from recycled water. Is it already in existence in Sydney?
So no, not yet. So purified recycled water, when I talk about it, it's water that's taken from industries and homes again. So you know, from kitchens, showers, toilets, etc. And then it's purified to meet Australian guidelines for water recycling for the purpose of then being put back into a raw, untreated water source. So some kind of environmental buffer like a lake or a dam or a river, before then being taken back out again, put back through a water filtration plant to then be supplied into homes. So effectively using recycled water to supplement those raw water supplies, rather than having a third network of pipes that just we treat it to a very high standard, put it back in through an environmental buffer, take it back out again, and then treat it as we would with any other drinking water. So we often call it triple treated water, because you know, the wastewater is treated, it then goes through an advanced wastewater treatment process so that we can put it back safely back into a raw water supply, and then it goes through a further drinking water treatment process after that.
Do people know much about it? When you talk about it, do people sort of go, oh yeah, I've heard of that before, or is it pretty new for Australian audiences?
I would say the general public probably is becoming more and more aware of it. Certainly our stakeholders that we deal with, a lot of people in council and other parts of other people in government that we talk to are becoming increasingly aware of it and quite supportive of it as well. The industry is very, very well aware of it, because it is used in, you know, many other countries around the world as well. I think there's 35 cities around the world where purified recycled water is already being used.
And the purified bit in the recycled water means that it is safe to drink. Is that the idea?
Yeah. So I've actually built so when we abbreviate everything, purified recycled water is a bit of a mouthful. So PRW is what you might hear it referred to. So we've built a PRW discovery centre so that we can demonstrate the performance and the reliability of the technologies that we're using to treat the recycled water to a quality that is suitable to supplement those drinking supplies. And so that's being done to really help to build community understanding and acceptance of purified recycled water. Yeah, it's definitely not new. It's it's been used since the 1960s. It's just new for Sydney Water. That's all.
So we're not using it at the moment, but you did say there is the Discovery Centre. What are you discovering from the process for Sydney? What would the benefits be for maybe for residents like you or I, or also for Sydney Water as a utility?
Yeah. So it is absolutely, and this is part of the work that we did in the long-term capital and operational plan. So it is absolutely the best value option for future water supplies for our customers and the environment. So at the moment, almost all of our water, as I said, at least 85% of it comes from dams that are largely in the west, and 80% of that is transported to 3 large coastal wastewater systems, which provide a partial level of treatment. It's a sufficient level of treatment for where it's being discharged, but it is then discharged into deep ocean outfalls 2 to 3 kilometres offshore. So by taking this recycled water, intercepting it to make purified recycled water, we will avoid the need to upsize very, very large wastewater infrastructure that heads towards the coast. And it will also defer the need for additional desalination plants. So you could kind of say you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So you get a new water supply sources, but at the same time you're avoiding a whole heap of expenditure in your wastewater systems as well. And so that's a huge benefit to customers because it will substantially reduce water bills into the future. It also provides a lot of benefit to the environment. So the fact that we are taking that wastewater out of the system, we're treating it to a much higher standard, means that those contaminants are no longer being discharged to the environment in the way in which they would be at the moment. So we can effectively close the loop on the water cycle. We can reuse more waste and produce a much more cost-effective source of water for the future that's also rainfall independent. So it's really a win-win for customers and the environment. I don't think people realise how little of the water that's on the planet is actually available as drinking water. So there's only 3% of the water on the planet that is fresh water, but most of that is actually then not even accessible by humans. It's in polar ice caps or very, very deep underground. And so, there's only about 0.4% of water on the entire planet that is available as drinkable water, but even then you still need to treat it to make sure that it is safe to drink. But at the moment, in most places around the world, we use water once before it then just gets discarded. So this would change that.
We definitely will be deep diving a little bit more into purified recycled water at our 2 subsequent webinars, and so we will share the link. If you haven't already registered for those, we'll be going into more detail about how it works and the process and a lot more questions around that. We've got some great questions coming in already, Kate, which is exciting. But I did just want to say, just ask one more question before we go over to the chat. We also had some questions submitted prior to the webinar as well. So thanks for everyone who's submitted questions when they registered. It sounds like Sydney Water's kind of quite serious at looking at purified recycled water. What's next in this space? Is it a matter of just having those discussions, or where to from here?
Yeah, so Sydney Water is very serious about looking at purified recycled water, and that's because it is such a good thing for our customers and the environment than any of the other alternatives on the table. And obviously, the impacts from the last drought, were very real, and we do need to start to build more water supply on a kind of continuous basis to make sure that we keep having sufficient water during drought. So I guess the next step, so we've got, you've mentioned earlier, the purified recycled water demonstration plant. We're really, really keen to get to get people out to that, and to, you know, better understand the technology. So that demonstration plant is also there to prove to, you know, our drinking water regulator and recycled water regulator that the technologies that we're implementing are reliable and can be used reliably. And obviously then, you know, it's a matter of working with stakeholders to ensure that we can bring it to fruition. But if the public support is there, then you know, more broadly, support will be there as well. So it's really about making sure that the community, which is, you know, the reason for these kinds of sessions, has a good understanding as to what it is. We don't want to foist it upon people and for folks to feel like they've not been involved in the conversation and haven't had a choice, or haven't had time to learn sufficiently about it. So that's the key thing for us to make sure that we keep progressing.
And so we've got a question here. What percentage of tap water consists of purified recycled water in Sydney at the moment? It's 0 at the moment, is that right? Or is
0 at the moment.
Excellent. I've learned something already. We did have another question there saying that, you know, does flooding affect recycled water? And then they sort of said, oh, this seems like a sales pitch for more desalination rather than recycling water. But I think maybe we've flipped things there, and that we've heard that actually recycling is what you want to do more of and what we're trying to explore. How does flooding affect it? Okay.
So flooding doesn't affect purified recycled water, if that was the question. You know, we're talking about what is coming into our wastewater systems through our wastewater treatment plants, etc. So flooding doesn't impact purified recycled water. If people might be concerned that if we're putting additional water back into the dams, that might exacerbate flooding further. But really, the kinds of volumes that we're talking about are very, very small compared to what you get in large flood events. So it's really quite a small impact, and it really wouldn't exacerbate flooding at all.
We also had a question about drawing water from dams following storms. It says, as the water quality decreases, is this lesser water quality caught in the dams? What happens after storms before the water can be drawn from the dams again?
Yeah, so Sydney Water doesn't manage the dams, but we work very closely with Water New South Wales, who owns and operates all the dams around Greater Sydney. And so there's several draw-off points on the dams. And so Water New South Wales has got, you know, water scientists out there who'll be looking at what the water quality looks like throughout the dam profile, and we'll select the cleanest water to treat. But when we have to provide water to customers, we don't really have a choice around, do we provide water from the dam or do we not? At the moment, that is where at least 85% of the water comes from. It's just a matter of choosing the best quality water so that then we can put it into our filtration plants. And as I mentioned, you know, we've got that desalination plant to help to supplement the volume of water when we do have to slow down our filtration rates. But what we're looking at into the future as well, knowing that these kinds of water quality type events with major floods will continue into the future, and we've seen several others over the last couple of years, that we also need to look at the treatment processes at our treatment plants to safeguard into the future as well, to make sure that we can continue, you know, the throughput that's required. We will always provide safe drinking water, but it's to make sure that we can continue to throughput without, you know, needing to put people on water restrictions or ask people to conserve water because we can't maintain the volume. Yeah, so it's you know, it's quite a complex piece, and there's quite a lot that goes along with it.
I had two questions which they're not really connected, but they I think you can answer them together, Kate. This is submitted prior to the session. One was about the fact that given the expansion that we're going to see in Greater Sydney, is purified recycled water also beneficial when we're talking about sewage treatment and disposal, because, you know, you're also helping to manage that side of things. And also Sydney Water have a role in the planning and expansion of stormwater and sewage infrastructure because of the growth that we're seeing.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the purified recycled water has got significant benefits from a growth perspective, because it does help us to address both the need for more water as well as the need to increase our wastewater system capacity. So we can do it much more economically efficiently and cost effectively by using PRW rather than upgrading the wastewater systems and then also building a desalination plant, which is kind of, you're doubling up on your costs there. But when it comes to stormwater management, so Sydney Water owns a range of large stormwater assets in the east. But I guess more interest might be the work that we're doing in Western Sydney, where Sydney Water's been named as stormwater manager in Western Sydney, where we've really looked at how to better integrate stormwater with land use planning, including, therefore looking at ways to keep stormwater in the environment so that we can minimise the impacts of stormwater on waterways. So, stormwater after it rains can cause erosion and has impacts on waterways. And so by keeping stormwater in open basins and wetlands and things and really slowing down the movement of that water, we can have a much better environmental or much lower environmental impact, and really try to keep those waterways unaffected by growth is the intention. So, and in Western Sydney, we're not just looking at, capturing that stormwater and then letting it flow back into the environment slowly. We're also looking to recycle that stormwater. And so, treating it to a standard that it can be used within industry. So there's an example of the new Mamre Road Industrial Precinct, where we've designed a stormwater reuse system that will then be supplemented by recycled water from the future Upper South Creek Advanced Water Recycling Centre that's currently under construction. So I think, that's been a really good initiative to have seen that embedded into those planning processes right up at the front. It can take time to kind of get good planning processes implemented, but it really has the benefits to communities and the benefits to the environment really can't be understated.
Do we need different DA approvals if we were to have purified recycled water, Kate?
So the PRW, or purified recycled water, doesn't need to be built into DA approval. So it's part of the bulk water supply, and that's needed for the whole city. So it would just be part of the typical water service. Where does the water and the wastewater service come from? You wouldn't need to worry about a separate DA approval. The purple pipe recycled water supplies that I just referenced the stormwater recycling in Mamre Road. So we do still do those purple pipe recycled water schemes as well. We do them on a commercial basis because it's a different level of service to what is provided to our general customer base. So, and that's, because those systems are more expensive than our usual approach to water management, and certainly more expensive than purified recycled water will be in the future as well. And so we're open to working with anyone who's interested, though, for their own sustainability purposes or whatever the other motivations might be, to look at a purple pipe recycled water scheme for non-drinking purposes. So it's particularly often industrial customers, for instance, that might be high water users who, for sustainability reasons, really want to tap into something that they can say outright is 100% recycled most of the time. So yeah, but planning those schemes can take time. So it is always best to reach out to us early so that we understand what the needs are.
Now, we had a great question, and it was also echoed at the registration from someone as well. I think a couple of people actually, and it's probably the one that I'm most interested in too, Kate. So help us out. Does purified recycled water remove microplastics, PFAS, and other chemicals from antibiotics or chemo, or all those things that we know can make their way into water supplies?
Yeah, so I expect that the next webinars, and a plug for the next PRW webinars as well, we'll get into a lot more detail on this front. But the answer is yes. So the technology that we use for purified recycled water, or would use for purified recycled water, is reverse osmosis. And so that can remove microplastics, it removes PFAS chemicals, it removes hormones, viruses, etc. So, people were often concerned around things like COVID-19 and the fact that, we were using wastewater testing to show where it was within the city. And so it's something that people will often, latch on to and be concerned about. But that reverse osmosis process removes COVID-19 and other viruses like that as well. So, and that's even before that treated water goes back into the environment. So that's part of that advanced wastewater treatment process. And then, the water goes back into the environment, and then we will treat it again before it comes into your pipe network. The other thing that we're doing as well is looking to work closely with industrial customers around what is discharged into our wastewater system. So there's particular controls that we will put on different customers with different needs to help to manage that waste, that risk into the system as well. But reverse osmosis is the same technology that we use for desalination. It requires a lot less energy though for PRW, and that's just because there's fewer contaminants. As you can imagine, salt water is like it's full of salt. It's a lot. There's a lot to remove through that reverse osmosis process, whereas with purified recycled water, the water that's coming into the plant is already, it's a treated wastewater product already, and so therefore there's a lot less to remove. But of course, we know that the science changes over time, and new chemicals can emerge that that may become a concern into the future. And so, this is something where, the treatment train that we're using is really well established globally. There's a really good understanding of what the treatment processes can remove. Our number one priority, is and always has been the health and safety of our customers. And so I think people can rest assured that we're not going to do something that we think has the potential to, put customers' health at risk.
I have a question from Michelle about which suburbs receive desalinated water. Is it? Do you have suburbs of choice?
So I wouldn't be able to rattle them all off the top of my head, but certainly, so there's a limit as to how far we can push the desalinated water. So those suburbs are generally on the east coast. As we look to expand the plant and make the plant bigger, then we will likely need to start to push that desalinated water much further west. And that's something that we're going through all the processes of looking at the kind of network infrastructure required to keep pushing that water further west now. But you shouldn't, hopefully you shouldn't notice too much of a taste difference between the two. The thing that people don't realize is reverse osmosis actually removes everything from the water. And so you have to put minerals back in to make it actually taste like drinking water again. Otherwise it tastes awful. So we kind of put the salts and stuff that give water its lovely kind of taste back in the desalinated water. But hopefully you can't taste too much of a difference.
Too clean. Yeah.
Too clean. That's right.
We got a question from Elliot. Are there any other options being considered for future water supply? We've got desal, we've looked, we talked about the dams, and we've talked about purified recycled water. Would something like a coastal reservoir be feasible? Or that
sort of thing has been looked at in the past, but just from a financial and economic perspective, it hasn't stacked up. So people have spoken about, for instance, damming Parramatta River and turning it into a water supply. But I mean, really, if you're using the bits that are saline, it's effectively a desalination plant that you have to build anyway. And there's a whole range of other contaminants in the Parramatta River that we'd have to deal with too. So, from all the options that we've really looked at, purified recycled water is definitely the most cost effective. And as I mentioned, also has all those environmental benefits that a lot of other options don't necessarily have.
Fascinating. Does desal use renewable? It says reusable power. I'm pretty sure that's renewable.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Yes.
make that adjustment.
Yeah, that was so when the desalination plant was originally built, that was certainly one of the objectives. I think everybody is well aware that that desalination processes consume a lot of electricity. It's a lot of power required. So the power supply for the desalination plant is 100% renewable. There was a whole renewable energy supply that was built purely to service that desalination plant at the time.
Yep. We had a question, why is water from desal not mixed with dam water?
Because you don't need to, and people might argue, well, you don't need to mix the very highly treated reverse osmosis water from recycled water either, if that's the case. But we're not quite ready for that one yet. Baby steps, but yeah, you just don't need to blend that desalinated water. It can go straight back. It can go straight into the drinking water system very safely.
And we got a bit of a longer one from Jenny. Our catchment extends as far away as Goulburn, I understand. Does Sydney Water have any responsibility for strategic planning and management to protect the health and well-being of all residents and visitors in the broader catchment?
So no, our water supply obligations are to our area of operations. Having said that, though, the state government has got planning processes in place. So there's the Greater Sydney Water Strategy that a lot of people will have heard of, but there's also a state water strategy where the department, the DQ Water, as they're now known, takes accountability for the planning of overseeing all of that water supply planning for the state. So we do participate in the state water strategy as well. And in particular, there are some interlinkages of the water supplies in Sydney with a couple of other areas. So the Shoalhaven is another one where some water from the Shoalhaven comes to Sydney. And so we do work with I guess those other parts of the system that we are connected to make sure that we're at least not having a perverse impact on other water supplies outside of Greater Sydney.
And we've got two more questions, unless we get a flood of other questions coming in. And I will say that if you don't have your question answered, or if you have a subsequent question, we will put up some details shortly that you can contact Sydney Water and certainly get those questions answered, particularly if your question's really specific to an industry, a technology, or a suburb even that you've got a particular interest in. So the last two questions, Kate, we've got one about, I'm assuming in the context of purified recycled water, what would the future of existing sewage pumping stations and pipelines from house to treatment plant, what would their future be?
So the existing wastewater pipelines from house to treatment plant will continue. Like there will be sections that will still need to continue to be augmented as more growth occurs, and we plan for those kinds of expansions. But there's some specific larger changes that we would make where we actually have several wastewater treatment plants that treat water to a high level, but then put it back in another wastewater system to send it out to the coast. And so some of those locations are ones where we would look to actually take the water out there, treat it to a much higher standard, put it back into a waterway. And then that means that we don't have to put it into the wastewater system to send it out to the coast. So we've got some very large tunnels, wastewater tunnels, up to say 3 meters in diameter, that travel very long distances under Sydney. And so to avoid the need to put in another one of those tunnels, for instance, we can strip these flows out and turn it into purified recycled water. But all of this, we plan all of our systems as a system. So wastewater systems have got many kind of spines that come into the plant, and drinking water systems have got many that come out of the water filtration plant. And so we consider all of these kinds of opportunities or constraints and the growth for each of those systems as we plan them, really with a view to try to minimize the ongoing cost to customers, while also protecting the environment
And while Anna's going to share some little slide there about other ways that you can get involved, and while I ask you probably this final question now, Kate, what's the most significant issues you see for Sydney and for Sydney Water as our utility?
Oh boy, end with a banger, huh? Um, so in terms of and this is probably where I can plug the long-term capital and operational plan. And if people do want to know more about what we foresee as I guess the big challenges, but also the big opportunities for Sydney, there is a summary version on our website that you can all go and peruse. But I mean, there is the challenge that with climate change, it affects us in several ways. As I articulated earlier, it's not just about drought, but it's about, how flooding impacts our assets, how bushfire impacts our assets, how temperatures might impact our assets into the future. Obviously, there's growth as well. Sydney is an ever expanding city, and we're going to go from something like 5.3 million to 8 million people in the next couple of decades. And so we need to provide services to all those customers. There's also, the changing environment when it comes to cyber and what that means. So, technology provides us with a whole heap of opportunities around how we can do things more efficiently. But, there's also that cyber risk. And so we need to work out how we can really harness the technology, but at the same time, make sure that, what is a very critical service, like, the city cannot function without water and wastewater, how can we harness technology, but not put ourselves at risk from a cyber perspective. And then also, I mentioned that we have some assets that are 135 years old, still going strong. But we are now at the point where about 50% of our assets are over 50 years old. And so we invest a lot of money in renewing and maintaining our assets. And that's something that we really need to continue to do. How can we find better technologies to enable us to better identify, leaks and breaks before they occur? So that we can come in and fix them, and we don't have the kind of public disruption because a water main is, burst in a road. And so those things are all obviously big challenges to tackle. But the good thing is that the fact that they're kind of coming all at once actually makes it more efficient for us to tackle them. And the stuff that I've talked about today with purified recycled water goes a long way to addressing these kinds of concerns. It helps us diversify against climate change. It's going to help us service growth. But at the same time, it helps to diversify when it comes to things like cyber attacks, because you've got more, water supply options that you can draw from if something was to go out. And so, and then it also is putting less strain on some of those older assets that we've got in our system. And so, while you can look at it as, oh, these are all really big challenges, like I really flip it and look at it as, well, we've got a once in a lifetime opportunity to actually change the way that Sydney is serviced. And it's only because we have all of those things happening at once that, like, economically, it really actually stacks up as being the best value option to service Sydney into the future. As I said, go read the LT COP. And that's what we call the long-term capital and operational plan. And that gives a lot more information around all of that.
Wow. Well, as they say, Kate, when it rains, it pours. And so maybe one crisis is not as good as many crises. But it's been really fantastic to have your expertise. I don't know too many people who could answer the questions as effectively and as comprehensively as you have. There is a lot more that people can do. You can keep learning by joining our second webinar. If you've registered already, then fantastic. If you haven't yet, please make sure you do share it with colleagues, friends, family, your boss, whoever you think needs to know about it. We'll also be recording it. So even if you can't make it, but you want the recording, make sure that you register via the QR code. You can book a tour, so you can visit the Purified Recycled Water Discovery Centre at Quakers Hill. Shout out to anyone who's already done that. I know quite a few people who've been out there in recent weeks, and I've seen photos popping up on LinkedIn and various things. So it is absolutely a great way to see firsthand the process of purified recycled water. And if you want to know more about that, certainly we'll be discovering that at our second webinar. And as I said, if you've got questions, you can reach out, talk to people like Kate at Sydney Water and get your specific questions answered by that email, which is on the screen there as well. It has been a huge pleasure to be with you all today. So thank you to you, Kate. Thank you to all of our wonderful attendees, and make sure you join us for our second webinar on the 22nd and be part of that longer discussion about purified recycled water. Any last words, Kate?
Just thanks to Good for the Hood and yourself, Jo, for hosting, and thanks to everyone for taking time out of their day to learn more. It's fantastic.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.